Good afternoon, everyone. If you don't recognize this uniform, you're probably in the wrong session. So, this is, of course, more or less the original series uniform for medical or science officer, but the stripe's a little bit too large, but we do what we can. So, for those that are really worried about such things, we're going to talk about Star Trek in theology. Of course, as you know, in 1963, Doctor Who appeared in the scene in Great Britain. The American response to that, 1966, was Star Trek. It was an interesting time. The war was well and truly settled. It was over. Life had gotten back to normal. Industrialization was taking place and going forward again. The space race was on. People were interested in jet planes and rockets. The U.S. president announced that they're going to try to go to the moon, and people watching in earnest to see the flights and whether the Americans could beat the Russians there, because the Russians were winning every step of the way. Televisions had recently come about. People had universities and military had computers. They took up like 3-4 rooms the size of this, but they were fascinated by this brand new kind of stuff. Everyone was thinking about how quickly the future was coming. We now have peace, the future's coming. What's the future going to be like? And Star Trek, perhaps more than anything else, allowed an entire generation to imagine a future and what that future is going to be. And it was created by a fellow called Gene Roddenberry, and who's insisted in his contract that everything had to do with Star Trek is created by Gene Roddenberry on it. And so it was his idea and his vision, and even though a lot of other people wrote scripts and did things, he always had to okay it, and he wanted to get this vision through of what it was. And of course, it only went originally for 3 years. So in the late 1960s, we didn't have a television in our home. We didn't get one until the early 70s. I remember going to school and saying to friends, there's this really cool television show on called Star Trek. And my friend said, it's already been canceled. It was in reruns by then. But that was it for a lot of people. By the time people started discovering it, it had already been canceled, and the phenomenon just grew and grew. And of course, we're aware of the Trekkie phenomenon. What got people so fascinated? Why were people so interested in this vision of a future? It helped us imagine a more positive future. Remember, these are people who had just been through 2 world wars, a Great Depression, the Spanish flu, all sorts of difficulties. People wanted something optimistic. They wanted to believe that human beings had a better future. And Gene Roddenberry painted that future for everyone. And the ideology that comes through is very much his, and it's one of secular humanism. And he was quite anti-Christian in many of his views. Many of you know, we'll come to this later, he actually wrote a script for a movie called That God Thing that never got up because the theater producers, the people that own the movie company said, they'd crucify us for that. But we'll show a little bit there that went after the Christian God, in theism particularly, in doing that. So he was part of a generation that just said, we don't want to bother with this anymore. What we believe in is humanity. But there's also fascination with religion and moral values and other things. So even Christians quite enjoyed what Roddenberry had to do and what the series presented. I don't know if you can read any of that or not, but I'll read that for you. This is a quote from him that kind of basically says what his philosophy was. Star Trek was an attempt to say that humanity will reach maturity and wisdom on the day that it begins not just to tolerate, but to take a special delight in differences in ideas and differences in life forms. If we cannot learn to actually enjoy those small differences, to take a positive delight in those small differences between our own kind here on this planet, then we do not deserve to go out into space and meet the diversity that is almost certainly out there. So, for him, moving forward meant a whole new picture of the future. And of course, part of what he had in the humanistic vision of Star Trek was a very egalitarian society, and so we saw some things that you didn't see on mainstream television that much before. We saw people of different races. We saw Asians and a Russian, accent as a good guy. Wasn't quite all as uniform as you think, because originally Star Trek uniforms were meant to be unisex, and then they decided that the women would wear miniskirts. And there'd be one or two token ones. The rest, whenever they showed up, usually got killed off by the villains. So there's a long ways to go, but it's 1960s version of what a future would look like, in which everyone was happy and equal and unified. And in this vision, there doesn't seem to be any crime, at least not in starships. It's all the aliens they ran into. No one's using money. We've outgrown. There's no wars, although the recent past had those things. There have been huge wars, huge famines, huge things they referred to that they'd went through that caused them to react to say, we have to do something different. We have to be different. And suddenly, within a couple centuries, humanity reaches this kind of situation. Now, where is religion in all that? And this is an interesting comic. This was old-time, 1960s kind of families. And the little boy says, Dad, why are there no Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Star Trek? And the father says, because it's the future, son. Because in the future, we don't have any need for religion. We don't need jails. We don't need money. We don't need programs to help the homeless. We've gotten past all that. Everything's just great. And one of the things we don't have is we don't have religion. So there's no religious characters. There's no chaplains. There's little overt religiosity in the series and in the films themselves. And we're looking at the original series here, because honestly, every manifestation of Star Trek represents a slightly different philosophy, because it reflects something of the age and the humanism, the optimism of that time. So Next Generation is an entirely different thing. And then, of course, Deep Space Nine and Voyager is different still, and the kind of situation they portray. So we're sticking with the original series, and we'll make a couple forays into the movies based on the original series, so that took place. But if you're going to be humanistic, and Gene Roddenberry actually was a paid-up and very influential member of the American Humanist Society, and very, very keen on this, the whole thing is, what does it actually mean to be human? And one of the ways you show that is constantly show human beings encountering things, creatures that are very non-human. And this is a classic one, because they must have spent at least a day and a half making this creature. But suddenly you find out that humanity is not how we look. It's how we act. Who is this creature? Why is it there? What motivates it? Does it have feelings? Does it have needs? Do we show our humanity in being victorious, or do we show our humanity in showing mercy? Within the crew itself, the question was often seen in Spock, who is, of course, half human, half Vulcan. And that question, what does it mean to be human? What's my human side? What if we just remove those things we saw as faults in the human side? Are we then less human? Are we more human? Is it a more perfect kind of humanity that exists? So these are played with, and of course, the Next Generation, it's Data, who's Pinocchio. He wants to be a real boy. He wants to be human, and that's a recurring theme. So what is humanity? And for Roddenberry and other secular humanists of the 60s and 70s, it meant building on that which is good in us. And it was an optimism that the generosity, the ingenuity, the desire to explore new worlds, and of course all that while obeying the prime directive and not interfering, because that was obviously bad. That's the best of humanity. So what if you just had the best of humanity and took out the worst? Describing a world in which original sin never came into the picture. Trying to imagine a world in which that's all overcome, but yet never talking about sin. There's no such concept in Star Trek, but yet they could not get away from the idea of the gods. We remember Adonis, and this is interesting because it gave a clue as to how at that time the gods were dealt with. In Who Mourns for Adonis, we find the Greek god on a planet. And instead of saying, he's a fake, it's a pretense, no, the gods are real. They were just more highly advanced. They had technology. It was just science. So instead of saying there's no such thing as the gods, he tries to unmask them. And so there's Adonis, lonely, explaining he had to leave Earth because people stopped believing in him. It's a bit like Tinkerbell in Peter Pan. People stopped believing. And in the end, his last words as he fades away, as he disappears, are these: the time has passed, there is no more room for gods. Now, obviously Roddenberry couldn't say that the Christian God because they'd cancel the show and people would be upset. So it's some other gods. But the message for him was the same. For the Jewish, the Christian, the Muslim version of God, he felt the same thing. Perhaps there's something in reality there, but we've outgrown them. We don't need them anymore. We can rely on ourselves. That's the strength of humanity and of our humanism. He went a little bit further. They went further with this in Star Trek V, which is a movie based on the original series, but of course it's went on a bit in time. And of course in Star Trek V, that's when Spock's half-brother takes off and steals Starship because he's convinced that he's found the mysterious planet where God resides. And they get there and everyone's watching the movie, and here's this face that looks a bit like Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments and a bit Moses-like or God-like. And here's a being that says, yes, you found me, I am God. And lightning comes from his eyes and strikes things and does stuff, and it certainly looks like this is the being that's all-powerful. But is it God? And of course this raised the interesting question, because while it's leading us to believe they found God, what kind of God is it? God needs to use the starship. He needs to use the Enterprise. And Kirk finally asked, what does God need with a starship? Because this being is not God. Why? Because this being has limitations. This being, for some reason, has been trapped or put there by perhaps other beings just as powerful, more powerful, and can't leave this idyllic, Edenic planet. Needs a starship to get off. Will God, who created everything, need a starship? So suddenly, and in the shows, it's always Kirk that finally figures things out. You know, at the end, that kind of tweaks at the obvious and says, yeah, I see it now. Wait a minute. Everyone's thinking, maybe this is God. Maybe this is God. But why does God need a starship? Answer me that first. Why does God need a starship? And obviously, Christianly, that's right. The true God doesn't need a starship. The true God who creates everything is completely self-sufficient, doesn't need that. This is a very, very powerful being. Being extremely powerful does not make one a god. Any more than Adonis in one of the earlier episodes was a god, but not really a god, just a being that was a lot more technologically advanced. And once you understand the technology behind it, and that theme recurs over and over in the Star Trek series, you have beings that look supernatural, they're very powerful, but it's advanced science. Once you unmask it, once you unplug them, once you figure out how to counter it, that's it. That's the magic. Which is a different approach than just saying, there's nothing supernatural, there's nothing to this, there never were any gods, there isn't such thing as God. Instead of the flat-out denial, it runs in this way. Did Roddenberry and the Star Trek writers ever actually deal with Christianity? In the first series, they do, one time. Do you all remember it? Yep, it's a classic one. And so Bread and Circuses, The Rise of the Sun. And of course, there they get in the planet and they recognize right away the Romans. And the Romans, they're it's all about control. The Romans are still running the world, and they're still trying to work out ways to control the population, stay in authority. But there is a bit of a cult, a rebellious movement of sun worshippers that they're trying to put down. And it's an interesting show because it's sort of a humanistic nod to Christianity. We have the gladiator combat. We have all the things that we typify the Romans, but who was most often the victims were these group of people who were sun worshippers. And one of them helps them, and they befriend, and his name is Flavius, and he's killed. And at the end, they all get back in the starship, they escape, they get out of the world without, of course, changing anything, because you don't want to interfere. And then we have this really famous piece of dialogue. You might not be able to read it from that, but it goes like this. McCoy: Captain, I see in your report Flavius was killed. I'm sorry. I like that huge sun worshipper. Spock: I wish we could have examined that belief of his more closely. It seems illogical for a sun worshipper to develop a philosophy of total brotherhood. Sun worship is usually a primitive superstition religion. Uhura: I'm afraid you have it all wrong, Mr. Spock. All of you. I've been monitoring some of their old-style radio waves. The Empire spokesman trying to ridicule their religion, but he couldn't. Don't you understand? It's not the sun up in the sky. It's the Son of God. Kirk: Caesar and Christ. They had them both. And the word is spreading only now. McCoy: a philosophy of total love and total brotherhood. Spock: it will replace their imperial Rome, but it will happen in their 20th century. Kirk: wouldn't it be something to watch, to be a part of it, to see it happen all over again? Mr. Chekhov, take us out of orbit. Ahead. Warp factor 1. Aye, sir. And there they go, leaving you to believe what's going to happen, to see it all happen again. Because the idea is, while we rely on human beings, the gods aren't what we think they are. It was a very different kind of mood to what we get, for instance, in the New Atheism today that's quite anti-Christian in its impact. What we find in Star Trek was a view that said, okay, we can appreciate that religions have done some good things, that Christianity has done some good things. We can appreciate that this idea of all people being equal, this idea of caring for everyone, this idea of universal love, these were good things. And Christianity stood up to the empire, the force of the Empire of Rome with this philosophy of love, and so they portray it happening here, but delayed 2,000 years for the message to finally spread. And now that it's spreading, it's going to change everything. But the power is in the message of what they call universal brotherhood, sisterhood, all people being equal. It's in the message of love. It's not the power of God. Jesus is a prophet. It's tapped into something that's universally human. So it's not Star Trek trying to get a Christian theme in. It's Star Trek giving a nod saying, okay, Christianity, the church, has done some good things. There's been some good come out of it, but it's because it's built on what are human values that we can all accept and understand. In the 79 episodes that were made, they never once go to Earth. It's viewed once in the distance on screen. That's it. It wasn't about Earth, but in taking human beings in an entirely different context, they wanted to get a message across. The show became so popular because people wanted to hear something optimistic. They wanted to believe again that human beings could do something right. You have to remember the time. The Second World War had just ended 20 years earlier. We just used all of our technology to basically annihilate one another. And that was following upon doing it just 2 decades prior to that. The Korean War had just fizzled out. The Vietnam War was ramping up in the U.S., and of course Australia involved as well. We had huge problems with racial intolerance. In America at that point, you had the movement for rights of African Americans really coming on strong, in people asking questions they hadn't been confronted with before, and others saying, what's wrong with us? And after a while of hearing so much negativity, if you say something positive, you receive quite a warm, resounding response. You hear so much negative, 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 and people wonder, is there anything good? Is there anything right? It's like if you're a student and you're working that paper, and the lecturer says, this is wrong, and that's wrong, and that's wrong, you need to do this, and you need to do that, and you're just completely devastated, because you just like them to say, this is really good, though. Your insight here is wonderful. Your calculations here were good. These observations, you want to have something good that you can build on. And humanity was looking for something positive and optimistic that didn't go the route, of many in the 60s. We're going to escape from this, and we're just going on one big drug trip. And Hitler said, they didn't do drugs. These people weren't on drugs. They were high on life and on adventure and on doing good things and on exploring and on building all the best attributes of humanity. Now, the reality is, coming up now, and it's been 50 years already. Yeah, sorry. It's been 50 years since it first started, over 50, and it first appeared. We're probably not tracking so well at achieving the future presented to us in Star Trek. Technologically, some things are even more advanced than they had imagined. Of course, other things were impossible and always probably were, traveling at warp speed, but you need to have some mechanism. They knew that. Otherwise, you don't go very far. It's a very boring show because you check in week after week and say, how are we progressing? Still halfway to Mars, Commander. You want to hurry up and get to the next planet because that's where things happen. To explore, like the old ocean-going people that went out and explored new continents and islands and wondered what was out there in that imagination. And that was it. The final frontier is space. That was it. Everything else is known. What else is there? Can that draw out the best in human beings? And that positive message came about. People took to it. And it surprised the television executives when conventions started up and people started dressing up and going and writing letters of protest and wanting to see more. And the reruns just kept showing and showing and showing. The show would not die. There was something fundamental about it. As Christians, we need to understand that. We proclaim to people and tell them about the sinful nature, and you need to do that. You need to be realistic, but at some point you need to say, you're also made in God's image. There's also goodness in you. We can also do good things. There's also hope. We talk about the law and what's going to happen if you don't do this and don't do that, and sometimes that's the only message in some periods in some churches we've been known for giving out. What about the love and forgiveness of Christ? That needs to come in too. There's room for optimism. Unfortunately, in Star Trek, it was only optimism in human beings. There was no pessimism. There's no room for sinfulness. There's no way to understand when it went wrong. Everyone in Starfleet will do good. No one's going to get jealous. No one's going to gossip and bicker. No one's going to undermine one another. They're all going to be willing to sacrifice for the greater good. It's the ideal vision of our humanity. And as Christians, examining it, we get a glimpse in the kind of atmosphere, mood, and the kind of humanism that existed in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. But it also tells us something about how to deal with human beings today. How do you plug in to making the good news really good and not just bad? But to do it without ignoring sin, without ignoring our human predicament. Well, that was just an introductory, some reflections on Star Trek. So we're finished. Beam us out of here. And I was asked to speak for half an hour and leave when we started a bit late, so we cut that a little bit short so we have time for questions. Leave 15 minutes for kind of questions, discussion, comments you have. And we can go beyond just the original series, but that's what we want to stick to for continuity's sake, because as you know, for fans, each series brought in some very new kind of ideology, and it starts getting a little bit their view of religion, of God, of human beings, and even how good everything is in Starfleet gets a little bit edgier. As you know, in Deep Space Nine, they had a lot of infighting and difficulty on Deep Space Nine, but many said you can't do this because it can't happen among Starfleet officers, so that's why we had all the others there. So it's the Bajorans, it's the Ferengi, it's the others that are there that get involved in the plots. He knows the Starfleet officers never ever get involved in any of the subterfuge against someone else. So the idea is there. If everything else is going wrong in the world, you can still trust Starfleet.
Section 31, not too sure about that though.
If they get there's always
went a bit further.
the exception to prove the rule, or even in Voyager, you had the idea, couldn't there be renegade Starfleet? And that was wild stuff. That was risky business. But they still had to come together and discover their true calling in Starfleet. They can still work together now in this situation. But they realized that in the late 60s, people were accepting this. Now we got into the 80s, the 90s, and beyond. People want people a bit more realistic. Said it's not happening like that. We want people who can relate to. We want to see some more faults, some more tension, and still come up with an optimistic view, but one that's more believable exactly because it includes the faults. So, sorry, questions, comments? Yes?
One of the things I'll admit being incredibly Star Trek is I speak Klingon. I do a lot of online forums with people who see themselves in the Star Trek universe. I think one of the things like the Klingons and the Cardassians and DS9 particularly you see is when they come to that discussion without the idea that Starfleet is always right, there's no defense of it. Starfleet and the humans in the stories are always, what we do here is justified because we're Starfleet.
Yes.
And we don't do wrong. But as soon as you put a character in there that goes like...
Why?
In DS9 there's the Cardassian Taylor who's constantly going, really? Really? You think that's all right? There's no thing of we're right because we have a morals thing.
And that's the thing. It's based upon a presupposition. We're good, we're right, we're the good guys, we just are. And you have to accept it. And someone from outside that, it's why? What's the justification? Of course, he had no religious and theological foundation. There's nothing to go on except, belief in humanity. But when you go beyond humanity, so I think the writers, they tweak to this, and that's why you play with it a little bit without kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater in some of the later series. But in the original series, it's just, that wasn't really thought of, just like no one really thought, here's a world in which men and women are equal, but women can't be starship captains, and they have to wear miniskirts for the uniform. It's like, But yet there was some breakthrough stuff because women had prominent roles, and a black woman, and that just didn't happen on American television. So to now we're saying that's kind of a bit tokenistic, but for the day it was pretty groundbreaking stuff.
The elements of nationalism, perhaps, for that era, nationalism was still very big and important.
It was huge, and that was one of the risks they had to do. It's clearly America is the main thing that comes to the future. It's the U.S. It's United, Federal, but USS still is what they. So they kind of picked up on this. The USS Enterprise, all the ships had these numbers. The nationalism gets portrayed now. It's kind of planetism. Earth is the main thing, and Vulcan's pretty cool. And beyond that, we're a little bit distrustful going out there. But they tried to give a message. They were trying to challenge it in the way it was in the day there. And of course, at the time, because I grew up in that era, there was one enemy, and it was the Russians.
Which is the Romulans.
That's who we feared more than anyone else. Yeah, they were the ones that we really were worried about. And they put a Russian on the starship saying, right now, yes, but think about the future. They might be our friends someday. Because, and that was just that little thought in there. And of course, they do that. Could we even make friends with the Romulans? Or the Klingons? The Klingons are probably more the Germans. They were the barbaric, we're kind of afraid of the Asian hordes or something that came through. And of course, they played with the costuming. The Klingons have evolved and changed. And the latest Star Trek series has kind of reinvented them in a way that has not went over too well, but we won't go there. Matt?
Yeah, so it's interesting you mentioned their view of kind of like God and religion as a phase.
As we mature and evolve, we grow out of it.
Exactly.
And so we tolerate it. It can be some good things. We're not saying there's nothing to it, but the goal is to outgrow it and grow out of it. And that attitude never leaves in any of the Star Trek movies or series. That attitude's always there. The Bajorans really plays with that most because there's like, hey, there's something here, there's something to it, we take it seriously, but then it kind of turns out, wait a minute, they're just worshiping aliens that live in the wormhole.
Yeah, so
But now we understand it, you debunk it. You just have to understand it.
Yeah, so I was going to show a second episode in my talk. I ran out of time, but it was from series 1 of Next Gen, and it involves them coming to a planet which is a utopia of perfect behaviour and everything like that. Obviously goes wrong really quickly.
Which they always do, by the way. As soon as you see sci-fi movie and people end up on utopia, you're like, it's going to turn to dystopia very quickly. There's something being hidden. There's something propping up this perfect world.
Picard, just before the credits start for the episode, says, it looks like the perfect place. Nothing could go wrong. And you just go, well, yeah.
Yeah, no, they're all going to die.
They're all going to die. But what happens is that they find that there's this force or space station or whatever that's fluctuating between this dimension and another one, and it's incredibly powerful. And when they actually go and they talk to the people about it on the surface, on the planet, they say, oh, that's God. And they find out that really all that God is for these people is an incredibly powerful superior being who just happens to be in orbit over them. And when they actually, Data does a little bit of his thing of interacting with this superior being,
the deity,
this group of people, he says, oh, well, they just recognise that it's appropriate for this stage in this species evolution for them to have
this
a
belief.
Superior being.
Yes.
And once they've grown out of that,
we'll tell them.
Then we'll tell them and then we'll move on. But for now, it's really important for them to have
And
one.
that's the message.
Don't ruin that.
It's a bit of a crutch, so let people believe this if
Yeah.
it helps, but you will outgrow it. And whenever you have a divinity or great power in every single episode, it's all you need to do is understand it. Once you understand how it works, you realize, okay, they're more powerful than we are. They have greater technology, but it's still just a being like us. It's not God, and it's not even a God in that sense, and that's an important message.
There's an episode in the old series going back called Way to Eden, which again is the utopia one,
Yep.
and almost everyone buys into the utopia, goes down, and he's happy on the planet. And Kirk
Yep.
is suddenly without his ship, and he doesn't like that, so he convinces everyone to come back.
Yep.
And the final three lines coming out of it is McCoy saying, "Oh well, we're kicked out of Eden again," and Kirk proudly saying, "No, this time we chose to walk out." And that seems to be like the really, the end that fits there.
Yeah.
But the final line is actually Spock, who just says, "All I know is I was happy."
Yeah.
And that's just, I find that really a fascinating one, particularly for Spock, who is emotionless, to have that sense of...
To have that breakthrough, to say, they keep in hinting, there is something there is something to it. They don't just say, look, you're all deluded, but and the way they're saying, religion's something we're going to grow out of, the gods are something we grow out of, God is something you don't need, but you don't need it. And this is something... One more thing, if you're ready for this. This is from the movie that never happened. This is one of the lines of Spock, that the God thing that Roddenberry wrote in the cinema said, yeah, we can't do that. If this is your God, he's not very impressive. He has so many psychological problems. He's so insecure. He demands worship every 7 days. He goes out and creates faulty humans and then blames them for his own mistakes. He's a pretty poor excuse for a supreme being. Now, I wonder why they went to run with that. So that's Roddenberry's view of Christianity and the Christian God, wanting to kind of take that view on himself and say, here's what I think, here it is, but that's a little bit too direct and too specific, and people said no, especially not in America, that's just not going to go over. So that was one of the lines Spock would have had in the script, taking that on. In a way, it would have been interesting for Christians, because when you name it and say it, it gives us a chance to say, okay, let's talk about that. There's several points made. God, we worship every day, all the time. Just, we gather together to support one another every 7 days. It's not quite right. Does he create faulty human beings? No. Does he blame us for his mistakes? No. And on that basis, a pretty poor excuse for a supreme being. In a sense, Spock's famous logic tends to go out the window here when it comes to religion. And maybe it's one of the reasons it didn't go ahead. But this is revealing not so much for the world of Star Trek, but for the world of the mind of Gene Roddenberry and that kind of 1960s, that post-World War II style, atheist, humanist kind of thinking that very gently and patronizingly looks down on Christians and spiritual people and says that this is what I think. And so this is what he's trying to get across. And the production companies had enough sense to realize this isn't going to play well with people. You could do some other little subtle little pointers to make people think, but this is kind of a head-on assault. And he was under a bit of pressure because people were saying, in the humanist society, we were saying, you're not a very good humanist. You should do more of this and more of that. And what about all this stuff? You keep throwing these bones to religion. You need to actually come right out and put this in its place. And I think that was partly his response to that, perhaps. But you can get a hold of the script. It was something he wrote, but I don't. There might come a day in which there's enough anti-Christian sentiment in the world that they'll produce it. And
Hollywood is still Jewish money.
And go over it, because what hits Jews and Muslims as well. So there's a lot of people be very upset, but it might, someday there. But interesting little thing, and a lot of people will be surprised and say, Spock said that. If Gene Roddenberry had his way, he would have. Any other questions or comments? We have a minute, maybe two.
Anybody actually caught the anti-Star Trek, the Orville, at all since it came out?
The Orville. Yeah. Oh, yes. It's
brilliant.
It is. And why is it brilliant, do you think? Because for me, it's like I've only just watched a few episodes of it and immediately identified all the Star Trek trekkiness that was through it.
But without being Star Trek, so they can do things different. Star Trek is bound to all these rules and logic of the universe, and people said it'd be nice to have Star Trek, but to loosen up on some of these things, and that's what Orville does. Yep.
Actually, more Star Trek than Discovery.
Yes.
We're never going to talk about Discovery.
Yes, like you were saying, it's about there's something about our humanity these days that actually enjoys watching our heroes, and we talked about the superhero ones last year. We enjoy watching our heroes fail. We enjoy.
You can identify with a faulty hero.
Identify with fallen heroes.
Yeah. If they're faulty, and the reason why is this: if they're faulty, we think, wait a minute, they messed up, they stuffed up, but they still saved the day. We could maybe there's hope for us. That's what, and that's been discovered long ago. King David in the Bible. Why not write all this? Good grief, he had this affair with Bathsheba, then had her husband killed to try to cover it. What a mess! Why not write that out? Because people can look and say, but he still did all these good things and is a man after God's own heart. So we could, there's hope for King David. And so the idea of a faulty hero that's imperfect but still does good things is important. In the original Star Trek, the officers are they're too perfect. We look at them and think, I would lose my temper. I would have got upset. There's something, but they're almost beyond human. Here's just one simple example, and the whole thing, the Star Trek. Where are the toilets on the Enterprise?
Next Gen has them.
Yeah, I know, but they didn't do it in the first one because someone kept asking that and saying, but the humanity right to that, it's stuff that we feel uncomfortable talking about that show how human we are, because these people are almost beyond human. You can't have people like Spock and Kirk say, just a moment, I've got to go to the loo first, I'll be right back. Or having a little conversation, washing the hands coming out of the toilets. They didn't want to be that human, but when you have it, you think, wait a minute, I use the toilet. I have biological functions. I wash my hands. Maybe I could do something good and great. That's the reality, and little things like that. But you take them out, and you have these heroes, but they're no longer examples to relate to. And we see that in biblical stories as well. Now, I've just been given a sign 2 minutes ago that we had 5 minutes left. Do we have one final comment or question? And it will be answered in Klingon. So no one will ever know what was said. I hope you enjoy continuing to watch the new movies coming out as the Star Trek world continues to evolve, and enjoying the original series. It's not a Christian worldview. If anything, Roddenberry's mind was quite set in anti-Christian ways, but he was fascinated with humanity, and with religion and with ethics, and that's stuff we're interested in. So there's all sorts of things we can learn about and talk about and see what worked and what got people's attention as we live and work among people, present the gospel. There's nothing wrong with enjoying Star Trek, but be aware that it's not a Christian series. But strangely enough, for someone who is so anti-Christian in his viewpoint, there's so many things come out that we can talk about and use positively because he was willing to go there and talk about ethics, talk about religion, talk about gods, talk about these things. And in a sense, the conversation comes to us and continues to come to us in the Star Trek world. And it is a brilliant series.
To go where no other person has gone before.
No other person. Used to be no other. Yeah, I had that on there. The no other, that got changed. Yeah, when no other person has gone before, and that's about humanity, to explore and say, let's do something different. What's out there? That's part of that we consider one of the good things about human beings. We want to explore, want to do something different, want to do that, and Roddenberry firmly believed that there was life on other planets, and eventually, when we were ready, we would discover it, or they would discover us, and there's a brilliant future out there. That optimism that was strongly there, but of course, along with that, at the time, there's the pessimism, because most people that thought there's life on other planets at that time would have thought as soon as they find us, they're going to try to take us over, because that's what we would do to them. Whenever we discovered a new continent, what did we do? We invaded it, we settled it, we migrated, so we just assumed they're going to be just like us. And so there was that war of the worlds kind of thinking. And here's someone saying, no, I think there's life out there, and probably most of it's pretty nice, and we can learn something from them. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And may I just say, live long and prosper.
Peace and honor.
So we're going to have